Maggie ran barefoot through the snow because there had been no time to find her shoes, and she ran because the alternative was to stay and be killed. And she understood, somewhere past the pain and the cold and the blood in her mouth, that this was the last running she would ever do. That she would either get free tonight, or she would not get free at all, ever, in this life. She was 24 years old. She had been married 6 years to Roy Kessler, and for the first of them he had merely frightened her, and for the last 5 he had hurt her, worse and worse, the way such men do. And tonight, drunk and raging over a supper gone cold, he had hurt her badly enough that she had seen in his flat, mean eyes the thing she had long feared was coming. And she had waited until he stumbled to the barn for more drink, and she had gone out the back door into the killing January dark with no coat and no shoes, and nothing at all but the torn dress on her back, and the desperate animal will to live. The woods behind the Kessler place ran up into the mountains, and Maggie ran into them, because the road led to town, and the town belonged to Roy. Everyone in it too afraid of him or too indifferent to a wife's bruises to help her, and she had learned across 6 years that there was no help to be had among people who could see and hear and chose to look away. So she ran from people into the wild, into the deep snow under the black pines, and the cold took her bare feet almost at once, and then the cold took the pain of her feet, which was worse, and she ran on numb, bloodied stumps she could no longer feel, falling, rising, falling again, her split lip and her swelling eye and her cracked ribs all fading into one great whiteness of cold, and she did not know where she was going, only away, only farther, only until she could not run any more. And at last, a long way up the mountain, she could not run any more, and she went down in a drift to her waist and could not rise, and she thought, with a strange calm, that it was all right, that freezing in the snow was a gentler death than the one waiting for her at home, and that at least she would die free and out of doors under the cold, clean stars, and she let her cheek down against the snow and closed her one good eye and waited to be done. She did not hear the dog at first, she was past hearing, but the dog found her, a great shaggy gray creature that came bounding through the drifts and stood over her, and set up a deep insistent barking into the night, and behind the dog, unhurried, came a light, a swinging lantern, and behind the lantern came a man. He was enormous, a broad, dark shape against the snow, bearded, in a heavy coat, and Maggie, surfacing for a moment from the cold, saw him coming and felt the old terror flood her even now, even here, even dying, a man, a big man, coming for her in the dark, and she tried to crawl away and could not, and she got out, through her split and swollen lips, "Please, please don't, please no more," and braced for the blow. The blow did not come. Instead, the big man knelt in the snow beside her and set down his lantern, and Maggie saw his face in its gold light, a broad, weathered face with a dark beard, and above it, the gentlest gray eyes she had ever seen, wide now with alarm and pity, and she waited for him to speak, to demand, to threaten, the way men spoke. And he did not speak. He looked at her bruised face, and her bare blue feet, and her torn dress, and something terrible and tender moved across his features, and his mouth worked as though he would say a thing, and no sound came out. No sound at all. He tried again. She saw him try, saw the effort in his throat, and there was only silence, and then he seemed to give it up, and instead he did the only thing there was to do, which was to shrug out of his own great heavy coat and wrap it around her frozen shoulders, warm from his body, and then, so gently, so carefully, as though she were made of spun glass, he gathered her broken, frozen body up into his arms and stood, and Maggie Kessler, who had run from a man to die in the snow, was carried out of the snow by another man who never said a single word, and she was too far gone to make any sense of it, and she let the darkness take her at last against a stranger's warm chest, certain she was dreaming, certain no such gentleness could be real. His name was Noah Sutter, and he had not spoken a word in 30 years, since the scarlet fever that nearly killed him at 8 had burned his voice away and left him silent for life. And he lived alone on Wolf Creek with his dog and his traps and his silence. And he was about to become the whole world to the broken woman in his arms, though neither of them knew it yet. He had been a talking child, Orla would tell Maggie later, a bright chattering boy, until the fever swept the valley the year he was 8 and took 2 of his sisters into the ground and took Noah's voice as the price of leaving him alive. He had come out of it whole in every other way, strong and clever and kind, but the words never came back. And a boy who cannot speak in a hard country learns young how the world treats the different. The other children had mocked him. The grown folk had talked past him, or, worse, talked slow and loud as though silence meant simpleness. And Noah had grown up wrapped in a loneliness as deep as any Maggie would later know. He had gone up to Wolf Creek as a young man and made his solitary life there, trapping and trading, keeping to himself, and if it was a lonesome life, it was at least a peaceful one, free of the cruelty of a world that had never troubled to learn his language. He had never married. He had never thought to, what woman, he had long ago decided, would want a husband who could not say her name. And so he had made his peace with solitude the way a man makes peace with a missing limb, and had not known, until a dog led him to a dying woman in the snow, how much of his great, gentle heart had been waiting all those silent years for someone to give itself to. Maggie woke to warmth and firelight and pain, and for a long moment did not know where she was. And then the fear came, and she jerked upright with a cry and looked wildly about her, and found herself in a snug log cabin, wrapped in warm quilts by a blazing hearth, her ruined feet bound in clean linen, and sitting a careful distance away with his hands open on his knees, so as not to frighten her, the big bearded man from the snow, watching her with those gentle gray eyes. And beside him, bustling, a small spry old woman with white hair, who saw Maggie wake and came at once with a cup, saying, there now, you're safe, child. You're safe. Drink this." And the ordinary kindness in the old woman's voice was so unlike anything Maggie had heard in 6 years that she began, helplessly, to weep. The old woman was Orla, the big man's aunt, who lived down the creek and had been fetched to help nurse the frozen stranger, and it was Orla who explained, gently, over the following days, the things the big man could not say for himself. "That's my nephew Noah found you," she said, "out checking his lines in the dark, and the dog wouldn't quit, and he followed her, and there you were, half in your grave, carried you 2 miles down the mountain in his arms. He's not able to tell you himself, poor lamb, lost his voice to the fever when he was a wee boy, never spoke since, not once in 30 years, but he hears fine, and he understands every word, and there's not a gentler soul walks this earth, so don't you be afraid of his quiet. His quiet's the safest thing you'll ever know." And Maggie, who had spent 6 years flinching from a voice that shouted and cursed and threatened, looked at the silent man tending the fire so as not to crowd her, and felt something in her chest she had no name for, and did not know yet that Orla had spoken the truest words of her life. She healed slow. Her feet had been frostbitten and cut, her ribs cracked, her face a ruin. And it was weeks before she could stand and longer before she stopped waking in the night with a scream lodged in her throat, sure she was back in the Kessler house. She told her story in pieces, as she was able, mostly to Orla at first and later in the silent language to Noah. She had been 17 when Roy Kessler came courting, and he had been charming then, or had known how to seem so. Flowers and compliments and a easy laugh, and Maggie, an orphan girl with no family to warn her and no dowry to make her cautious, had been dazzled, and had married him within the season, and had discovered the truth of him only after the door had closed and the law had made her his. It had started small, the way it always does, a harsh word, a grip too hard on her arm, an apology after, a promise it would not happen again. And then it had grown, year by year, the words crueler, the grips becoming blows, the apologies fewer, until Maggie had come to understand that she had married not a man but a slow trap, and that the trap had the whole weight of law and custom and a town's indifference holding its jaws shut. She had thought of running 100 times, but a woman alone, with no money and no kin, and a husband's legal claim on her had nowhere to run to, and Roy had made sure she knew it, and so she had stayed, and endured and shrunk year by year into a silent, frightened ghost of the girl she'd been, until the night his eyes told her plainly that the next beating would be the last one, and she had chosen the snow. But she healed in that warm cabin on Wolf Creek, tended by an old woman's hands and watched over by a silent man's gentle eyes, and slowly, very slowly, for trust broken as hers had been broken does not mend in a day, she came to understand the nature of the place she had fallen into. There was a morning, early on, that she never forgot. She had dropped a crock and it had shattered on the floor, and the old terror had seized her instantly, the certainty of punishment coming, and she had shrunk back against the wall with her arms up over her head, shaking, waiting for the blow. And Noah had come in at the sound and taken in the shattered crock and the cowering woman, and understood, and he had not come near her. He had knelt down, slow, at a distance, and begun quietly gathering the broken pieces himself, his big, gentle hands careful, not looking at her, giving her all the room in the world, and when he'd finished he had set a fresh crock on the shelf and simply gone back out, and never by so much as a glance made her feel she'd done wrong. And Maggie had slid down the wall and wept, because in 6 years of marriage a broken crock had meant a broken face, and here a man had cleaned it up in silence and left her a new one, and it was such a small thing and it undid her entirely. Noah Sutter asked her for nothing. He harmed nothing. He never once raised his hand or his voice, for he had no voice to raise, and Maggie, who had learned to read the coming of violence in the smallest shift of a man's tone, found that with Noah there was no tone to read, no rising anger to brace against, nothing but the quiet in his steady, gentle actions, and by degrees the constant animal fear she had carried for 6 years began, in the safety of that silence, to loosen its grip. For it was a strange and healing thing, she found, to live alongside a man who could not speak. All her married life, words had been weapons, Roy's words, cutting and cruel, the shouted threats, the mocking, the way he could flay her with his tongue before ever he raised his fist. She had come to dread the sound of a man's voice more than the blow that followed it. And here was Noah, who had no such weapon, who could not shout, nor curse, nor threaten, nor belittle, who could only show her what he meant through his hands and his eyes and his patient actions, and everything he showed her was kindness. He left small things where she'd find them, a warm shawl, a bird he'd whittled, wildflowers dug from beneath the snow in the sheltered places. He learned, without being told, the foods she favored and the way she liked the fire built. When her nightmares woke her, he did not come near, knowing it would frighten her, but she would find in the morning that he'd sat up the rest of the night in the far chair keeping watch, so She'd not be alone in the dark. And Maggie, who had forgotten there was any other kind of man in the world, began to learn a new language, the wordless language of Noah Sutter, in which love was not something said but something done over and over in 1,000 small unspoken acts, and she came to understand that it was a truer language by far than the one that had only ever hurt her. They found ways to talk. Noah could read and write, taught by Orla long ago, and he carried a small slate on a cord. And they passed 100 conversations back and forth on it, his careful hand and her spoken words, and there was a slowness to it, a deliberateness, that Maggie came to love. For a man who must write down his words does not waste them, does not say a cruel thing in temper and call it back too late. Every word Noah gave her he had chosen, and so every word was kind. And more than the slate, they learned each other's faces and hands. Noah taught her the signs he and Orla used, and Maggie proved quick at them, and soon they could speak across a room without a sound, a whole silent tongue of their own, and Maggie found she could tell Noah things in that quiet language she had never been able to say aloud to any living soul. The whole of her 6 years, the fear and the shame and the slow murder of her spirit, pouring it all out to a man who could not interrupt, could not judge her with his tongue, could only listen with his whole gentle self, and, when she was done, take her hand and hold it, which said more than any words of comfort ever could. She had run from a house full of terrible words into the arms of a man with none, and she found, to her endless wonder, that the silence was where she finally learned to speak, and there was a freedom in it she had never known. With Roy, every word she'd spoken had been a risk, the wrong tone, the wrong subject, and the storm would break. She had learned to say as little as possible, to make herself small and quiet and unremarkable, to swallow her thoughts before they could earn her a blow. But Noah could not interrupt her, could not shout her down, could not turn her own words against her. He could only listen, and so, for the first time in her adult life, Maggie found she could say anything. She talked to him for hours by the fire while he mended traps or whittled foolish things and serious things, memories of her girlhood, her hopes, her fears. The whole crowded inner life she'd kept locked away for 6 years because there had been no one safe to open it to. And Noah listened to all of it with a completeness she had never been given by any soul. His gentle gray eyes on her face, nodding, smiling, now and then writing a question on the slate, or answering with his hands. And Maggie understood that being truly listened to was a thing she had been starving for even longer than she'd been starving for kindness. The mute man was the best listener she had ever known, precisely because he had spent 30 years unable to do anything else. Love grew between them the way the thaw comes to the high country, slow and then all at once. Maggie had thought herself dead to such things, beaten past the capacity for them, and she found instead that in Noah's safe silence she came back to life, came back to laughter even, and to hope, and at last to a tenderness for the big gentle man that frightened her with its depth. And Noah had loved her, Orla told her once, slyly, since about the second day, though he'd sooner have died than crowd a woman so wounded, and he only waited, patient as the mountain, for Maggie to be ready, asking nothing, pressing nothing, letting his quiet, steady presence say what his voice never could. It was the gentlest courtship in the history of the world, conducted almost entirely without a spoken word, and it was the surest, for there were no words in it to lie with. There was a night that turned it, though neither of them planned it. A late storm had come down and shut them in, and Orla was snowed in at her own place down the creek, and Maggie and Noah were alone in the cabin with the wind loud on the roof and Maggie had been telling him, and the signs and on the slate, the hardest part of her story. The part she had never told a living soul, the night she'd lost the one baby she'd carried, early in the marriage to one of Roy's rages, and how she'd grieved it alone because there was no one to grieve it with, and how Roy had told her it was her own fault for angering him. She had never spoken those words aloud in her life. She gave them to Noah now, haltingly, weeping, and when she was done she sat with her face in her hands, braced for she did not know what, some flinching away some judgment. And she felt Noah move, and looked up, and the big silent man had knelt down before her, and there were tears on his own weathered face running freely into his beard, and he did not try to write anything or sign anything. For some grief surpassed all language, spoken or otherwise, he only took both her hands in his great gentle ones and pressed them to his chest over his heart, and held them there, and looked at her with his whole soul in his streaming eyes, and Maggie understood him perfectly, every word he could not say. "I am so sorry. I am here. You are not alone with it any more." And she leaned forward and put her forehead against his, and the two of them stayed like that a long while in the firelight while the storm blew itself out. Two people who had each been so alone no longer. It was not a spoken word that healed the deepest wound in Maggie Vaughn. It was a silent man kneeling to hold her hands against his heart, and she thought, ever after, that no words in any language could have done half so much. But Roy Kessler was not a man to let a possession go. He had assumed at first that Maggie had frozen in the woods and had been not much troubled by it, a wife being cheaper to replace than to mourn. But the winter wore on, and word drifted down from the high country, there is always word, that the silent trapper up on Wolf Creek had a woman living at his place now, a dark honey-haired woman who turned up half dead in the snow, and Roy Kessler put two and two together, and something mean and possessive woke in him. Not love. Roy had never loved anything. But she was his. She had run from him, made him a laughingstock, and worse, she was living now with another man. And Roy Kessler's pride could no more abide that than any brute could abide being bested. And the law, such as it was, stood with him, for a wife in that country was a husband's to keep, and no sheriff would trouble a man over the recovery of a runaway spouse. So Roy Kessler took his rifle and rode up to Wolf Creek on a hard bright day at winter's end to collect what was his and teach the mute fool who'd sheltered her a lesson in the bargain. Maggie saw him coming from the cabin window, and the sight of him struck her like a fist, 6 years of terror flooding back all at once, and she went white and shaking and could not breathe. And Noah, coming in from the barn, saw her face, and then saw the rider, and understood everything in an instant, and Maggie watched the gentle, silent man she loved change into something she had not seen before. Not cruel, never that, but immovable. A great still wall of a man planting himself between the window where she stood and the yard where her husband was dismounting. And she understood that Noah Sutter, who had never in his life raised his hand in anger, was about to raise it now, for her. Roy Kessler came into the yard loud and cursing, rifle in hand, bawling for his wife, calling her filthy names, ordering her out, and when the cabin door opened it was not Maggie who filled it but Noah, huge and silent and unmoving, and Roy sneered up at him. "You the dummy been keeping my wife warm? Heard you can't talk. Good, then you can't argue. She's mine, lawful wed, and I've come to take her home, and if you've laid a hand on her all," and Noah Sutter, who could not speak a word, answered him without one, he simply came down off the step and walked toward Roy Kessler. Slow and certain, unafraid of the rifle, his gentle face gone hard as granite. And there was something so absolute in that silent advance that Roy, for all his gun and his rage, took a step back. "Stay off me," Roy snarled, bringing the rifle up. "Stay off, you dumb brute. I'll shoot, I swear." And Maggie found her voice. She had not spoken above a whisper in her own defense in 6 years. But she came out of that cabin door now, out into the cold, bright yard, and she stood beside the silent man who had given her back her life, and she looked at Roy Kessler, and she said, loud, clear, steady, the words ringing off the snow, "No, no, Roy, I'm not yours. I never was, no matter what the law says. You beat me for 6 years and left me for dead in the snow, and I will die before I go one step back with you. And this man, this good silent man who's never said a word to me, has shown me more kindness with his quiet than you managed with all your talking in 6 years of marriage. So put down that gun and get off this mountain, because I am done being afraid of you. Do you hear me? I am done." And her voice did not shake, and she was astonished to find it did not shake, for the silence of Wolf Creek had taught her, at last, how to speak. What happened next happened fast. Roy Kessler, humiliated and raged past reason, swung the rifle toward the woman who dared defy him, and Noah Sutter moved. For all his size, he was quick, and he was on Kessler before the barrel came level, one great hand closing over the gun and wrenching it skyward as it fired harmlessly into the winter sky, the other fist coming around in a single tremendous blow that dropped Roy Kessler into the snow like a poleaxe steer, senseless before he landed. And Noah stood over him, chest-heaving, the rifle in his hand, and he did not strike him again. Though he might have, he only stood guard over the fallen man, silent, until it was certain he'd not rise, and then he looked back at Maggie with a question in his gentle eyes, "Are you all right?" And Maggie, weeping and laughing, signed back to him the words he'd taught her, "I am safe. You kept me safe." It happened that Orla had gone for the sheriff at the first sight of Kessler riding up, not trusting the man, and the sheriff arrived to find Roy Kessler trussed and groaning in the snow, and Maggie Kessler standing free and unafraid, and for once, for the tide had been turning, as word of Kessler's brutality spread and the town's long, willful blindness began at last to shame it. For once the law took the woman's part, there were her healed injuries, witnessed by Orla and the doctor who tended her. There was the rifle he'd fired at her, seen by all. There was a growing account, once women who'd long stayed silent found their courage, of what Roy Kessler was behind his own doors. He was taken away in irons that day, and in time he was tried and sent to the territorial prison for the attempt on Maggie's life, and the marriage that had been a 6-year prison was dissolved, and Maggie Kessler became Maggie Vaughn again, her own woman, free. She did not leave Wolf Creek. She had nowhere she wished to go that was not there. And one evening that spring, when the creek was running free and the first green was pushing up through the last of the snow, Noah Sutter came to her where she sat on the cabin step, and he was nervous, she could see, this great steady man, nervous as a boy, and he handed her his slate. And on it, in his careful hand, he had written, "I have no voice to ask you with. I never wished for one until now. I would give anything to say this out loud, but I will write it every day of your life if you will have me so you never once doubt it. Marry me, Maggie, I will keep you safe and I will keep you loved, and I will never raise my voice to you, not because I cannot, but because I never, ever would." And beneath the words he had drawn, clumsily, a little heart. And Maggie Vaughn read it and looked up at the silent man who had carried her out of the snow and given her back her voice and her life and her very self, and she did not reach for the slate to write her answer. She said it out loud. Yes, she said, clear and unafraid, the word she had been unable to say to anyone in kindness for 6 long years. Yes, Noah Sutter, 1,000 times yes. I spent 6 years married to a man who never stopped talking and never once said a kind thing. I would rather have a lifetime of your silence than one more day of anyone else's words. Yes, and Noah Sutter, who could not speak, made the only sound Maggie ever heard him make in all their long years together, a rough, broken, wordless cry of pure joy. Torn up from somewhere the fever had never quite reached, and he gathered her into his arms gently, always gently, and held her against his heart, and neither of them said another word, because neither of them needed to, for they had long since learned to say everything that mattered in the language they had built together out of silence and safety and small, unfailing acts of love. They were married that summer, in a quiet ceremony down in the valley, with Orla weeping happily and the great dog wearing a ribbon it deeply resented, and Maggie found that a house without shouting was a kind of heaven she had not known existed. A home where the quiet meant peace and never threat, where a raised hand meant only a caress, where love was spoken in 100 wordless ways from waking to sleeping. In time there were children on Wolf Creek, and the strangest and most wonderful thing was how they grew up. In a house where their father never spoke a word, they learned his silent language before they learned their spoken one. And the cabin was full of small flying hands and laughter, and the particular deep peace of a family that has learned to listen with more than its ears. And Maggie Vaughn, who had run barefoot and beaten into the snow certain she was going there to die, lived a long, full life on that mountain as the beloved wife of the gentlest man in the territory, and she used to say, when she told the tale to her grandchildren, that she had married the only man she ever met who never once said a cruel word to her, and that it was not, as they always guessed, because he could not, but because even if the fever had left him his voice, she knew to the marrow of her that Noah Sutter would have used it, every day of his life, only and always to be kind. For she had learned the truth that 6 years of a shouting house had hidden from her, and one winter of silence had finally taught that love is not in the words a person says, but in the 1,000 things they do when no words are spoken at all, and that the man who carried her home through the snow without a single word had told her, in that wordless carrying, everything she would ever need to know. She kept his slate, the very one, all her life, and after he was gone from her, for they were old by then and had had a long, good run of it. She would take it out sometimes and read again the careful words he had written her that spring evening on the cabin step, the little clumsy heart drawn beneath. And she would hold it to her own heart the way he had once held her hands to his. And she would think that she had been the most fortunate woman in all that hard country, to have run barefoot and broken into the snow, certain the world held nothing for her but cruelty and cold, and to have been carried out of it and up a mountain and into a life by the gentlest voice she ever knew, which never once in all their years said a single word and never once in all their years needed to.